Daniel Carter had always been the kind of man who believed in building things slowly and honestly. His early 30s were not marked by glamour or privilege, but by sweat, late nights, and stubborn belief in his own abilities. His one-bedroom apartment, though modest, had been transformed that evening into a warm cocoon of intimacy. Strings of soft fairy lights curved around the walls, casting golden reflections on the glass of red wine waiting on the table. On the bed sat a carefully wrapped gift, a delicate necklace with a small sapphire, Melissa's birthstone, bought after months of quiet savings. Kneeling on the floor, Daniel carefully adjusted the placement of the final card he had written by hand, each word spilling from him without hesitation. To him, Melissa Hayes wasn't just a partner. She was the woman who had given meaning to the sacrifices he made, the one he envisioned standing beside him as his startup took shape and as their life unfolded. He pictured her smile, that practiced tilt of her head when she pretended to be surprised, and he felt proud. For once he thought the timing was perfect. Everything was aligned: love, loyalty, and the promise of success. What Daniel didn't know, however, was that the night he had worked so hard to make unforgettable would become unforgettable for entirely different reasons. The sound that shattered the illusion was faint at first, a muffled laugh carried from the other side of the apartment. Daniel's brows furrowed as he set aside the ribbon in his hands. Melissa wasn't supposed to be back yet, but the sound was unmistakably hers, low, throaty, a laugh she reserved for moments of indulgence. Curiosity pulled him toward the bedroom door he had left slightly ajar, but as he drew closer, unease hardened in his chest. Through the narrow gap, his eyes locked on a scene that made his blood turn cold. Melissa was there, tangled in sheets that were meant to be for their night, her body pressed against Ryan Mitchell, Daniel's business partner since college, and the closest thing he had to a brother. The room seemed to tilt, reality warping in a way that his mind refused to process at first. Betrayal wasn't just the sight of her lips on Ryan's neck. It was the slow realization that, wow, he had been pouring his soul into building both a future and a company. The two people he trusted most had been quietly dismantling him behind closed doors. His body froze, his breath caught in his throat, and for a long, humiliating moment, Daniel stood powerless, a spectator to his own undoing. When Melissa finally noticed him, her face betrayed no shame, no panic. Instead, she wore the faintest trace of satisfaction, like a chess player who had cornered her opponent in checkmate. That small smirk cut deeper than any blade, confirming what Daniel had always refused to believe, that love, for her, was never about him, but about what he represented. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ryan, scrambling for words, stammered half an apology that rang hollow before it ever reached Daniel's ears. Melissa, on the other hand, sat up slowly, pulling the sheets around her with calculated grace, her expression as sharp as the glass of wine Daniel had poured moments ago. "You were never enough for me," she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed, each syllable striking with precision. "He has vision. You're just safe." Those words detonated inside Daniel, stripping away not just his pride, but the very foundation of his life. Safe, that was what he had been. Reduced to a placeholder, a stepping stone. He had offered devotion, loyalty, and a steady hand. But in Melissa's eyes, those qualities weren't enough to build a future worth choosing. The confrontation escalated not with shouting, but with her cold indifference, a cruelty more devastating than rage. When she rose to leave, Ryan trailing behind her with eyes averted, Daniel's gaze fell on the briefcase Melissa carried. It wasn't hers, it was his. Inside it lay months of work, his early-stage pitch deck, investor notes, and the carefully curated contacts he had worked tirelessly to assemble. As the door closed behind them, the hollow echo of her stilettos faded down the hall, leaving Daniel surrounded by the wreckage of his illusions. In a single night, He had lost not only the woman he loved, but the friend he trusted and the company he had built his dreams upon. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, financial, existential. And as Daniel sank to his knees amidst the fairy lights and unopened wine, the story shifted from heartbreak to survival. Daniel Carter's story had never been one of shortcuts or privilege. Born into a working-class family on the outskirts of the city, his father pulled long hours as a mechanic while his mother juggled shifts at a diner to keep food on the table. College was never an option, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, Daniel built his education in the quiet hours after work, teaching himself coding, finance, and business fundamentals with nothing more than borrowed library books and secondhand laptops. Nights stretched into mornings as he poured himself into his first prototypes, driven not just by ambition but by a desperate need to prove that his life could mean more than survival. He learned resilience in those late hours, how to make progress with little more than grit and persistence. Yet Daniel's greatest strength, his loyalty, was also his most dangerous weakness. He trusted people too easily, avoiding confrontation even when his instincts whispered otherwise. To friends, he was the dependable one, the safe harbor in the storm. To Melissa, he was a steady flame that could light her path without ever threatening to outshine her. But beneath Daniel's modest exterior was an unpolished brilliance, a mind capable of seeing patterns others missed, a vision waiting for the right moment. For years, he believed that hard work and loyalty were enough to secure love, friendship, and success. He never imagined that the very qualities that defined him would make him the easiest target for betrayal. Melissa Hayes had grown up in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, and where wealth was not a goal but a birthright. Surrounded by social circles that thrived on comparison, she learned early to equate status with self-worth. When she first met Daniel, his authenticity intrigued her. He wasn't like the polished heirs she'd grown up around. He had ambition, hunger, and the fire of someone climbing toward something greater. For a time, she fed on that energy, imagining herself as the woman who believed in him before the world did. But as years passed and Daniel's rise remained slow and steady rather than meteoric, her admiration soured into impatience. To Melissa, patience was weakness. She wanted results, attention, the sheen of instant success. In contrast, Ryan Mitchell, Daniel's childhood friend, had always known how to charm a room. Charismatic and opportunistic, Ryan wore confidence like a tailored suit. Yet behind his easy smile lurked envy, a simmering resentment of Daniel's incorruptible nature. Ryan wanted shortcuts, but he lacked the discipline to make them stick. He envied Daniel's quiet brilliance, the way ideas seemed to flow effortlessly when Daniel spoke. That envy turned poisonous, growing into betrayal when the chance to seize Daniel's work presented itself. To Melissa, Ryan offered exactly what Daniel did not: flash, momentum, and the illusion of grandeur. To Ryan, Melissa was the key to stepping into a spotlight he could never earn alone. Together, they embodied ambition without ethics, a hunger without loyalty, and the dangerous belief that betrayal was just another business strategy. The fallout left Daniel gutted in every sense of the word. The business he had built from the ground up was gone, repackaged under new branding and paraded by Melissa and Ryan as though it had always been theirs. Investors he had spent months courting now turned their eyes toward the glossy version of his idea, dazzled by Melissa's polish and Ryan's bravado. Daniel, once filled with restless energy, found himself hollow, trapped in his apartment with nothing but the ghosts of what he had lost. Shame ate at him. He avoided calls from colleagues, ducked out of social gatherings, and convinced himself he was finished before he had even begun. At his lowest point, he considered walking away from it, all selling his laptop, abandoning the dream, and disappearing into obscurity. But Claire Carter, his younger sister, refused to let him vanish. Claire had always seen through him, recognizing the strength he buried under humility. One evening, sitting across from him in their mother's worn-down kitchen, she told him words that pierced through the fog of his despair. "She didn't destroy you. She freed you." To Claire, Melissa's betrayal wasn't the end. It was a brutal severing of ties that had been holding Daniel back. With Melissa and Ryan gone, he was no longer weighed down by false loyalty or by the need to prove himself to people who would never value him. Her words reframed his loss as liberation. For the first time in weeks, Daniel lifted his head, realizing that everything he had endured was not a death sentence, but an opportunity. The question was no longer whether he could rebuild, it was whether he had the courage to rise from the ashes. Daniel Carter had sworn to himself he wouldn't go. The idea of walking into a room full of innovators and dreamers, people who mirrored the version of himself he had once been, felt like rubbing salt into a wound that still bled daily. And yet, something masochistic drove him to attend the annual tech conference. Maybe it was guilt, maybe punishment, maybe the need to remind himself of what he had lost. The convention hall buzzed with energy, polished presentations, enthusiastic investors, eager developers. Daniel moved like a ghost among them, his posture hunched, his name tag tucked discreetly under his jacket. Then it happened, the moment that turned humiliation into ignition. On the main stage, under dazzling lights, stood Melissa Hayes and Ryan Mitchell. Their voices rang with confidence as they unveiled his stolen concept, a sleek demo that mirrored line for line the late nights he had poured into his code. The crowd erupted in applause. Investors leaned forward in interest, and cameras flashed. Daniel's stomach clenched as he realized he was watching his dream paraded in someone else's clothing. For a moment, he thought he might collapse, that the weight of betrayal would finally crush him. But as Melissa's voice carried over the speakers, polished and performative, something inside him shifted. The humiliation burned, yes, but so did anger, and beneath it, something even more dangerous, clarity. Daniel didn't storm the stage. He didn't shout accusations or crumble in the back row. Instead, he stood still, watching, his hands clenched into fists that no one else could see. A strange calm overtook him, not the absence of feeling, but the sharpening of it. Betrayal had already stripped him of everything: love, friendship, reputation, even his company. There was nothing left for Melissa and Ryan to take, but that also meant he had nothing left to lose. And in that void, Daniel made a quiet vow, one that carried more weight than any dramatic outburst could. If they built their empire on betrayal, I'll build mine on truth and crush them with it. For the first time since the night his world collapsed, Daniel felt a spark of control. Not revenge for its own sake, but the need to prove to himself most of all that he could rise higher without shortcuts, without deceit. It wasn't about taking Melissa and Ryan down in a single blow. It was about outlasting them, outthinking them, outbuilding them until the world had no choice but to see where true vision came from. In that vow, humiliation transformed into fuel, grief into ambition. He left the hall that day not defeated, but reborn, his silence more dangerous than any confrontation could have been. The path forward remained uncertain until a chance encounter brought Daniel face to face with Evelyn Ross, a seasoned CEO whose reputation for integrity matched her sharp instincts. Evelyn had once been a panelist who critiqued Daniel's earliest pitch, telling him bluntly that his ideas were raw, but his determination was rare. Spotting him lingering near the edges of the conference, she approached not with pity, but with curiosity. Daniel, worn down but not broken, confessed the truth, how his work had been stolen, how he had nearly given up, how he wanted more than revenge, he wanted to reclaim his sense of self. Evelyn listened in silence before delivering the kind of advice only a battle-tested leader could. If you want to win, you build. No excuses. Betrayal can't be your fuel forever. Integrity has to be. She offered no shortcuts, no handouts, only the promise of guidance if Daniel was willing to endure the grind again. For him, this was more than mentorship. It was validation that his fire still mattered, that someone of her stature could still see value in him despite his failures. The emotional stakes crystallized in that moment. This wasn't about Melissa anymore, nor even about Ryan. It was about power, not the corruptible kind they chased, but the kind that came from resilience, freedom, and the restoration of his self-respect. Betrayal had cracked Daniel open, but Evelyn's words gave him the blueprint to rebuild stronger. From that day forward, he would no longer run from the wreckage. He would rise from it. The path back was nothing glamorous. Daniel's nights blurred into endless loops of code, strategy documents, and rejected emails. He pitched tirelessly to small investors, only to be met with polite dismissals or, worse, quiet skepticism. His reputation, once that of a promising innovator, was overshadowed by Melissa and Ryan's narrative. In interviews, Melissa painted herself as the visionary who had rescued a half-formed idea from a man who couldn't execute, while Ryan smiled smugly beside her, dropping thinly veiled jabs about Daniel being the bitter ex with nothing. Their words spread through blogs and conference panels, shaping public perception until Daniel became more myth than man, a cautionary tale of wasted potential. Every rejection chipped away at his resolve, each sleepless night leaving him hollowed yet unwilling to quit. Coffee cups and sticky notes littered his apartment, a battlefield of solitude where the only constant was the glow of his laptop screen. Yet even as exhaustion pressed down on him, Daniel clung to a stubborn spark. He knew the grind would either destroy him or forge him, and he wasn't ready to decide which yet. But the grind came at a cost. Daniel began pulling away from Claire, the sister who had reminded him he wasn't finished. Whenever she called, he answered with half-hearted reassurances, masking the truth of his spiral. He told himself it was to protect her, to shield her from the toxicity of his obsession. But deep down, he feared he was becoming the very thing Melissa accused him of. Safe, predictable, small. Isolation wrapped around him like a cocoon, dangerous in its silence. Evelyn Ross, however, refused to let him wallow. She challenged him with brutal honesty, tearing apart sloppy drafts of his pitches, demanding clarity in his vision, and forcing him to rebuild discipline from the ground up. Where Melissa once mocked him for moving too slowly, Evelyn taught him that steady did not mean weak, it meant sustainable. Under her relentless guidance, Daniel began to grow not in bursts of glory, but in the quiet strength of a man who learns to stand again after being knocked flat. Yet the loneliness persisted, gnawing at him during late nights when doubt whispered louder than resolve. Growth, he learned, often required sacrifice, and the heart of sacrifice was distance from the people who loved him most. Temptation came in many forms. Old acquaintances approached Daniel with offers to leak damaging rumors about Melissa and Ryan, while anonymous messages suggested ways to sabotage their servers or expose financial shortcuts they had taken. Each offer tugged at the raw wound of betrayal, whispering promises of fast justice. And yet, every time, Daniel stepped back. Sabotage might have destroyed them, but it would have destroyed him, too, erasing the very line that separated him from the corruption he despised. His refusal became his moral backbone, a quiet rebellion against the world's demand for shortcuts. Instead, he poured everything into refining his prototype, one grueling iteration after another. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, change began. A handful of users stumbled upon his platform, praising its elegance and utility. Their feedback lit a fire, proof that his vision had weight beyond revenge. For the first time in months, Daniel felt momentum tilt ever so slightly in his favor. The tension, however, only deepened. Melissa and Ryan still held the spotlight, their empire glittering under bright lights, but Daniel's shadow began to stretch beneath them. His grind was no longer about survival. It was about building something so uncheckable that no betrayal could take it away again. Gala was the pinnacle of the tech industry calendar, a glittering night where innovators and investors mingled under chandeliers that symbolized power more than elegance. For weeks leading up to it, Melissa and Ryan had been billing themselves as the stars of the evening, hyping their groundbreaking platform as the next frontier of finance tech. The stage was theirs until Daniel Carter walked in. Dressed not in borrowed bravado but in quiet confidence, he arrived with a fully built version of his platform, sleek and functional in a way their shallow replica had never been. When his name was announced, whispers rippled through the room, some skeptical, some curious. But when he began his live demonstration, the whispers turned into stunned silence. His platform didn't just promise innovation, it delivered it in real time. Faster, more secure, more intuitive, every click unveiled a vision that no amount of marketing spin could fake. Melissa and Ryan watched from the wings, their smiles frozen as Daniel's system outperformed theirs line by line. The applause thundered not because the audience pitied him, but because they recognized undeniable brilliance. In that moment, Daniel was no longer the man they mocked as the bitter ex with nothing. He was the visionary who had outbuilt, outlasted, and outshone them on the industry's grandest stage. Just as the applause began to settle, the night detonated in scandal. Screens around the gala lit up with leaked emails Melissa and Ryan's correspondence laid bare for everyone to see. The evidence was damning: stolen IP, shady backroom deals, and desperate attempts to court investors with falsified metrics. Gasps filled the room as industry leaders and journalists devoured every word. Melissa's polished persona shattered instantly, her name now tied not to brilliance but to corruption. Ryan stumbled through excuses, his confidence dissolving as quickly as the crowd's respect. Investors who had once leaned in now recoiled, whispering about lawsuits and withdrawals. Amid the chaos, Melissa sought Daniel out, her eyes burning with venom. She cornered him near the stage, spitting the words like they were poisoned. "You stole the spotlight. That was supposed to be mine." But Daniel didn't flinch. His reply was calm, steady, as though he had been waiting years to say it. "You can steal ideas, Melissa, but you can't steal vision." The line cut through her anger, exposing the hollow truth beneath her ambition. For the first time, she was face to face with the reality that no scheme, no betrayal, no shortcut could replace genuine vision and integrity. And Daniel, once broken, now stood uncheckable. As the night unraveled, the shark circled fast. Investors who had once flocked to Ryan now severed ties in public, shaking their heads and muttering about ethical liability. Ryan's phone buzzed endlessly, each notification another door slamming shut. Withdrawn offers, severed partnerships, burned bridges. His charisma, the very thing he had leaned on all his life, was worthless against cold, hard evidence of corruption. He turned desperately to Melissa, expecting loyalty, but Melissa Hayes had built her life on self-preservation. Without hesitation, she distanced herself, crafting a narrative in real time that painted Ryan as the mastermind while she was the misled partner. Watching her slip away with calculated ease, Ryan realized too late that he had been nothing more than a tool, discarded the moment he lost value. Alone, disgraced, and cut off from the very empire he thought he had secured, Ryan faced the collapse of everything he had stolen. Meanwhile, Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Standing beneath the spotlight, his applause still echoing, Daniel had already won, not through revenge, but through resilience. The empire Melissa and Ryan tried to build on betrayal had crumbled in a single night, while his foundation, forged in truth and persistence, stood unshakable dot in the months that followed the gala. Daniel's life transformed not through luck, but through relentless effort finally finding its reward. His platform, once dismissed as a dream, quickly gained traction among real users who were desperate for a system that valued transparency over gimmicks. What had started as a handful of curious testers grew into a thriving community, praising the platform not just for its elegance, but for the integrity embedded in its design. Unlike Melissa and Ryan's shallow version, Daniel's product wasn't built to dazzle investors for a night. It was built to last, and people felt it. Soon, media outlets that had once branded him the bitter ex with nothing began to write new headlines. The visionary who rebuilt from ashes, or truth over hype, the Carter way. Daniel didn't chase the spotlight, but it found him anyway, because his work spoke louder than any smear campaign ever could. In industry panels, he was no longer the outsider, he was the innovator shaping the conversation. Investors who had once ignored him now stood in line, eager to align with a brand synonymous with resilience and ethics. But for Daniel, the greatest triumph wasn't the money or the recognition. It was standing tall, knowing he had rebuilt everything on his own terms. He was no longer the man defined by betrayal. He was the leader defined by vision. Inevitably, Melissa returned. The empire she had built on deceit lay in ruins, her reputation fractured, her alliances shattered. She approached Daniel one evening after a keynote speech, her voice softer than he remembered, her eyes carrying a carefully rehearsed glimmer of regret. She spoke of mistakes, of being blinded by ambition, of realizing too late what she had lost. "We could start again," she whispered, almost convincing in her vulnerability. But Daniel, steady and composed, saw through it. The woman who once dismantled him piece by piece now stood before him, hoping to reclaim what she had discarded. He didn't lash out. He didn't need to. Instead, he answered with the quiet dignity that had become his armor. "You taught me the price of betrayal. That lesson built everything I am now." His words weren't cruel. They were final. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Melissa was no longer the gatekeeper of his worth. Daniel's refusal wasn't about vengeance. It was about freedom. He walked away, leaving her with nothing but the echo of her own choices. For the first time, he realized closure didn't come from apologies or revenge. It came from standing in his truth and refusing to be defined by the past. Through all the chaos, one bond remained unshaken, the quiet strength of his sister Claire. For months, Daniel had kept her at arm's length, afraid that his obsession would poison the one pure relationship he still had. But as his platform grew and the dust settled, he sought her out not as the broken man she once comforted, but as the brother who finally understood the depth of her loyalty. Sitting across from her in the same worn kitchen where she had once told him, "She didn't destroy you. She freed you," Daniel finally acknowledged the truth. "You were my anchor," he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "When I was ready to give up, you kept me alive." Claire smiled, not the proud grin of someone who wanted credit, but the quiet relief of a sister who had finally gotten her brother back. Their bond, tested by silence and distance, emerged stronger than ever. For Daniel, healing wasn't just about rebuilding his career, it was about reclaiming the relationships that had mattered all along. The empire he built was more than a company. It was a testament to endurance, integrity, and love, the kind of love that doesn't betray. In that realization, Daniel found his true victory, not power over others, but peace within himself. Months later, the noise had finally quieted. The headlines faded, the conference stages dimmed, and Daniel Carter found himself in a new office, perched high above the city skyline. The glass walls stretched endlessly, offering a view of skyscrapers that glittered against the setting sun. But the silence of the room was what struck him most. No taunts from Melissa, no echoes of Ryan's bravado, just stillness, earned through sweat, scars, and relentless resilience. Sitting at his desk, Daniel opened a leather-bound notebook and began to write, not for publicity, not for strategy, but for himself. His pen moved slowly at first, then with conviction. The empire wasn't built on revenge. It was built on remembering who I am when everything is taken from me. He paused, reading the words back, and felt a deep calm wash over him. The empire wasn't about Melissa or Ryan anymore. It wasn't even about proving people wrong. It was about proving himself right, that the boy who once taught himself coding on borrowed computers, the man who had survived betrayal, was still whole. In those words, Daniel found closure, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and enduring. On the corner of his desk sat a small velvet box, unopened for months yet never discarded. The anniversary gift, the sapphire necklace meant for Melissa, had once been a symbol of love, then of humiliation, then of loss. Now, as Daniel picked it up, he no longer felt the sting of betrayal. Instead, he felt gratitude for the journey that gift had inadvertently sparked. He opened the box, looked at the delicate chain, and smiled faintly. It wasn't hers anymore, but it wasn't his to destroy either. It was a relic, a reminder of the man he used to be and the one he had become. Carefully, Daniel placed it into the bottom drawer of his desk, not as a weight to carry, but as a chapter closed. No bitterness, no desire to erase the memory, just peace. For the first time, he understood that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about transforming pain into strength. By setting the gift aside, Daniel symbolically freed himself from the past. It no longer owned him. He owned his story. As evening descended, Daniel closed his notebook and stepped out of the office. The city greeted him with its pulse of lights and motion, alive with the promise of tomorrow. Waiting just down the street was Claire, his sister, his anchor, the one who had believed in him when he had almost disappeared into despair. She waved when she saw him, her smile grounding him more than any boardroom deal ever could. Walking toward her, Daniel felt the weight of the past loosen, replaced by the steady pull of the horizon ahead. The skyline glowed, but his eyes weren't on Melissa or Ryan, or even the empire he had built. They were on what came next, the unknown, the future, the freedom he had fought to reclaim. As he joined Clara for coffee, laughter mixing with the hum of the city, Daniel realized that the true victory wasn't in crushing those who betrayed him, but in choosing where to place his gaze. And tonight, his gaze was fixed not on the ruins behind him, but on the horizon bright, unclaimed, and entirely his.